Let's pray. Father, we are so thankful to be here today, to be here with people who we have gathered together, Lord, in a church, in a gathering, in an assembly, but more than that, people who we've committed to do life with. And so we're thankful that we get to gather together and listen to your word, to worship together. Be with us throughout our time. We pray this in your name. Amen. All right, so if you want a handout, which has the sermon notes on it, Jay's going to be coming forward. And so if you do raise your hand, like I always say, it gives you a little bit of extra righteousness points. You don't even need to use them. But there are discussion questions on there and stuff. But here is how this morning you can become even more righteous than just by taking handouts. And that is by opening up a Bible or opening up something on your smartphone to Psalm 78. And the reason I tell you to do that today, and I'm going to emphasize it a little bit more, is because Psalm 78 is very long. It's about 62 verses. Actually, it's more than that. It's about 72 verses. And I'm going to read the whole thing to us. And so it's going to be much easier for you to listen and not just fall asleep. I know that, my voice is so soothing, and it's warm in here, and it's rainy outside. It's a great day to just sit around in your PJs and listen to a story from Pastor Jeremy and fade off into nothingness. I don't want you to do that, though, at least not at the beginning of the sermon. Like, give me 5 minutes. What we're doing is this. Today's sermon is really the second part of a two-part mini-series on thinking and reflecting on what God has done. This year, we're celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the very first services of Restore, which happened the first Sunday in November in 2009. And so that moment and some of the other 10-year anniversaries that take place throughout this year prompted me to want to think about what God has done in the life of our church, but more particularly the significance of what it means to reflect on what God has done. And so last week's sermon was called, Look What God Has Done. And this week's sermon is called, Look What God Will Do. Because what we discover, and we'll see it in this psalm that we're going to read today, is that what God has done, as we pass it forward, becomes the template that we can build our future on. That what God has done becomes the template for our future. And so we want to recount and remember what God has done. So I'm going to read us Psalm 78. Now, one of the reasons that I'm decided to read this whole chapter, even though there's, of course, no way that I could address everything that's in it, I thought, well, there are some elements of the history of Israel in here that I could probably just skip over or not deal with. And I thought, well, then I'm missing the whole point, right? Like, the whole point is recounting what God has done. It's telling the story. And if I skip the story, then I'm not actually doing what the passage is asking us to do, which is to tell the story. So there will be, again, it's a long psalm, but I trust that you who are adults and are sitting here, and even you who are children, will be able to pay attention as you follow along, of course, on your smartphones. Also, I'll tell you in advance, you probably won't be able to read it on the screen, because since it's so long, it was like every slide kept getting smaller and smaller text. So whatever, you can go for it if you want. All right, here we go. Psalm 78. Give ear, O people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known, that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded to our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and that they should not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. The Ephraimites, armed with the bow, turned back on the day of battle. They did not keep God's covenant, but refused to walk according to his law. They forgot his works and the wonders that he had shown them. In the sight of their fathers, he performed wonders in the land of Egypt, in the fields of Zoan. He divided the seas and let them pass through it, and made the waters stand like a heap. In the daytime, he led them with a cloud, and all the night with a fiery light. He split rocks in the wilderness and gave them drink abundantly as from the deep. He made streams come out of the rock and caused waters to flow down like rivers. Yet they sinned still more against him. Rebelling against the Most High in the desert, they tested God in their heart by demanding the food they craved. They spoke against God, saying, "Can God spread a table in the wilderness? He struck the rocks so that water gushed out and streams overflowed. Can he also give bread or provide meat for his people?" Therefore, when the Lord heard, he was full of wrath. A fire was kindled against Jacob. His anger rose against Israel because they did not believe in God and did not trust his saving power. Yet he commanded the skies above and opened the doors of heaven, and he rained down on them manna to eat and gave them the grain of heaven. Man ate of the bread of the angels. He sent them food in abundance. He caused the east wind to blow in the heavens, and by his power he let out the south wind. He rained meat on them like dust, winged birds like the sands of the seas. He let them fall in the midst of their camp, all around their dwellings. And they ate and were well filled, for he gave them what they craved. But before they had satisfied their craving, while the food was still in their mouths, the anger of God rose against them, and he killed the strongest of them and laid low the young men of Israel. In spite of all this, they still sinned. Despite his wonders, they did not believe. So he made their days vanish like a breath, and their years in terror. When he killed them, they sought him. They repented and sought God earnestly. They remembered that God was their rock, the Most High God, their Redeemer. But they flattered him with their mouths. They lied to him with their tongues. Their heart was not steadfast toward him. They were not faithful to his covenant. Yet he, being compassionate, atoned for their iniquity and did not destroy them. He restrained his anger often and did not stir up all his wrath. He remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes and comes not again. How often they rebelled against him in the wilderness and grieved him in the desert. They tested God again and again and provoked the Holy One of Israel. They did not remember his power or the day when he redeemed them from the foe. When he performed his signs in Egypt and his marvels in the fields of Zoan, he turned their rivers to blood so that they could not drink of their streams. He sent among them swarms of flies which devoured them and frogs which destroyed them. He gave their crops to the destroying locusts and the fruit of their labor to the locusts. He destroyed their vines with hail and their sycamores with frost. He gave over their cattle to the hail and their flocks to thunderbolts. He let loose on them his burning anger, wrath, indignation, and distress, a company of destroying angels. He made a path for his anger. He did not spare them from death, but gave their lives over to the plague. He struck down every firstborn in Egypt, the firstfruits of their strength in the tents of Ham. Then he led out his people like sheep and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. He led them in safety so that they were not afraid. But the sea overwhelmed their enemies, and he brought them to his holy land, to the mountain which his right hand had won. He drove out nations before them. He apportioned them for a possession and settled the tribes of Israel in their tents. Yet they tested and rebelled against the Most High God and did not keep his testimonies, but turned away and acted treacherously like their fathers. They twisted like a deceitful bow. For they provoked him to anger with their high places. They moved him to jealousy with their idols. When God heard, he was full of wrath, and he utterly rejected Israel. He forsook his dwelling at Shiloh, the tent where he dwelt among mankind, and delivered his power to captivity, his glory to the hand of the foe. He gave his people over to the sword and vented his wrath on his heritage. Fire devoured their young men, and their young women had no marriage song. Their priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. Then the Lord awoke as from sleep, like a strong man shouting because of wine. And he put his adversaries to rout. He put them to everlasting shame. He rejected the tent of Joseph, and he did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loves. He built his sanctuary like the high heavens, like the earth, which he has founded forever. He chose David his servant and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the nursing ewes, he brought him to shepherd Jacob his people, Israel his inheritance. With upright heart, he shepherded them and guided them with his skillful hand. The story of God that we read in the scripture is handed down through his people generation over generation so that God's people can have confidence in how God will also move on our behalf. That's the gist of what I'm going to say today, that the story of God is handed down generation to generation so that God's people can have confidence in the way that he will work on their behalf moving forward. And I do want to emphasize the story of God. In fact, Jesus himself quotes verse 2 of this psalm to talk about why it is that he speaks in parables. He quotes verse 2, which says this, "I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old." Now, the reason that these stories are dark, they're dark sayings, is because it's not that they were hidden or not that they were secret or not that people didn't know them. They were dark because of the way that the people responded. They ended up in tragedy and calamity. But it's not that they weren't known. They were known. And so anyway, but we need to tell the story. We need to constantly tell the story so that we do know. Starting next week with the beginning of Advent and then going all the way through Easter, we're going to start a new series called The Story of Jesus. And it's sort of a play on two things. Number one, we want to see the story of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, but the way that we're going to do that is by looking at Jesus' parables. So we're going to see not just the story of Jesus, but the stories of Jesus as we go through the Gospel of Luke. Now, we'll begin telling Jesus' story during Advent and, of course, end with Jesus' story at Good Friday and Easter, but in between, we'll look at those parables. So that's where we're going. But we tell the story of the people who came before us so that the people coming after us take the right course. We recount what God has done so that those who hear it and those who come after us will take the right course. Because as you can see from this chapter, the people before the author of this psalm, they end up in calamity. It's not like a happy story of what happens to them. It's a story of how they failed. And there's one simple reason that the psalmist puts forward why they failed. And it's compared and contrasted throughout the whole psalm. It's that they forgot. They forgot what God had done. And that's what ends them up in the situation that they're in. They forgot what God had done. And that's contrasted with the fact that God remembers. They forgot, but God remembers. Now, I said last week that I want to reflect a little bit on Restore as we go through this and, make some observations and some things that I would just want us to know at this particular point in history at 10 years. It's not necessarily the case that every church that's in decline is not preaching the gospel. You can look around and you can see a lot of churches that are struggling. A lot of churches that aren't doing well, that in the next, who knows how many years may close their doors and have to sell their property or whatever it might be. It's not necessarily always the case that those churches were not preaching the gospel. But more often than not, the reason that churches end up in decline is that they simply forgot. They forgot the main reason for their existence. They forgot what their message is. They forgot the gospel of Jesus Christ. They, at some point, became more focused on what they were doing and upholding their own institution or their own traditions or their own rituals or whatever it is, and they forgot. They forgot what God had done. So how do we keep ourselves from forgetting? That's the question that's being presented to us. Well, the obvious answer is, by remembering. Don't forget. How do you not forget? Well, you tell the story. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at 4 things that remembering the story, what we will learn from remembering, what we will be taught by remembering. Starting with this, we remember the past and we remember what God has done because we are prone to similar error. I don't know if you're familiar with the phrase, "Okay, boomer." If you're not, basically it's, I think everybody's on the same page with what that means. But if you're not, in case you want to know, the phrase "okay, boomer" is sort of a sarcastic way of saying that boomers are all stupid and responsible for handing younger generations nothing but a pile of problems. That's the sarcasm behind the phrase. It's like if you see your parents doing something, if you're a millennial or, you see your parents doing something that's completely ridiculous or saying something that you think is completely ridiculous, you just write them off by saying, "Okay, boomer." Okay, whatever, you don't know what you're talking about. Now, the reason I bring it up is because if you read Psalm 78 through a certain lens, you could look at it and be like, isn't that exactly what the psalmist is doing with the previous generations? Isn't he being like, okay, let's talk about how bad the previous generation screwed everything up. If you want to know why the economy's bad, or if you want to know why the environment is in shambles, or you want to know why the country's so divided, it's their fault, right? Previous generation's fault. And he says it right up front. He's in the lyrics. He's like, this is a song that we're going to sing because I don't want you, my children, to be like my grandparents who were stubborn and rebellious. And so you could look at it through that lens. Because this song goes on, and it's a story about how the generations before him were terrible. They grieved God. They messed up. and they ended up in calamity, right? Verse 10, they're cowardly. Verse 17, they rebelled against God. Verse 32, despite all that God does, they don't believe. Verse 37, their hearts were not steadfast, and they lied to God. Verse 41, they tested and provoked God. Verse 57, they acted treacherously. Verse 58, they cheated on God with idols. And on top of that, apparently God is pretty mad. Verse 21, God was full of wrath and kindled a fire against Jacob. Verse 31, the anger of God rose against them, and he killed the strongest of them, laying low the young men. Verse 33, he made their days vanish like a breath. And then the grand conclusion, when God heard, he was full of wrath, and he utterly rejected Israel. You know, this sounds like something the psalmist might bring up in front of an assembly of the elderly in the church and read it to them and be like, how dare you? How dare you? Look at what you've done. Or maybe like the psalmist is like, okay, Ephraim. Okay, Israel. But to view the psalm through that lens is to miss the point. It's to actually do the very thing that the psalmist is warning against. To look at the previous generation and say of them, you're the reason that we are in the trouble that we're in, is to make the assumption that you would have somehow done better. See, to look at those who came before you and go, well, see how they screwed up. I would never have done that. Is to assume that somehow you are superior, that you would not have acted the very same way that they did. And in fact, the point of this psalm is to show you just the opposite. Actually, the whole point of recounting what has happened in previous generations is to show you that you are prone to the same sort of failures that they are prone to. That we are prone, if we do not know where previous generations have failed, we are prone to make those same mistakes. Maybe it won't all look the same. You know, but the very same thing that destroys capitalism is the same thing that destroys socialism. Human selfishness and greed. Selfishness and greed destroy capitalism the same way they destroy socialism. So the question isn't like, were they wrong and are we right? Or is the future better than the past? The question is, have you learned from their mistakes? Have you learned what is at the heart of the problem? We don't recount the deeds of those who came before us so that we can mock or feel superior. We mock not because we're better. We don't mock, not because we're not better, but because we are the same. And this is one of the inherent dangers of starting a new church. See, in an ideal world, every new church that started would be focused solely and only on the gospel and on the good news of Jesus. But the truth is that mixed in with those positive motivations is that there's usually something else intertwined in there with the purity of mission that believes there are things we can do better. And the easiest way to do them better is to start fresh. And that really is true. You start a new church, you will do things better, you'll make the right decisions. And like I said, truthfully, that's often the case. It's a lot easier to correct course by starting something new than it is to change an institution that already exists. It's like hitting the reset button. But the problem is that we can only respond and react to the problems we see. And we aren't necessarily familiar with what got previous generations stuck to begin with. And so things will inevitably come up that we weren't anticipating, and at some point, every church, if God tarries, will go from being a new church to an old church. They will go from being a young church to a mature church. And when they reach that phase, and then at some point, by the way, every church will close. There aren't perpetual congregations meeting just for thousands of years. Every church at some point ceases to exist, even if the building remains. So how do you make sure that you don't repeat the past, that you can avoid the pitfalls of the past, that you don't get stuck the same way that previous generations have sometimes gotten stuck? The answer is you tell the stories of the past. To remind us that we're prone to the same errors that they were. Here's the second thing. We remember and need to remember that God deals with generations. One of the things I often try to emphasize is that God often deals with communities and not just individuals. And one of those communities is the generation, the community of generation, those around the same age grouping as you. Now, generations tend to share common characteristics because of similar life experience, similar events, similar things happening in culture at the moment when they're raised. Now, not everybody in a generation typically fits the stereotype, right? Not everybody in the generation acts the same way that other people in their generation does. But the psalmist is like, that generation back there, they were wicked and stubborn. Now, was everybody in the generation wicked and stubborn? No. There were some people who were faithful. There were faithful people, there were wicked people. And I don't know what percentage it is that makes God say, well, overall, they were wicked. Is it like a simple majority, 51%? Or is it the leadership? Could it be that they say, well, we don't know about the people? I mean, so often in the nation of Israel, the nation was defined as evil or following God based on the king, based on where he stood. Now, did the people begin to worship idols because they had an evil king? Or were the people worshiping idols so they elected an evil king? You know, what comes first? Do the celebrities, do the leaders that we look to, do they simply define who we are as a culture? Are they a reflection of us? Well, I don't know what it is that makes a generation wicked or evil. I don't know what the metric is that God uses. But what we need to know is that in every generation, there are wicked and there are good. There is evil and there are the faithful. In every generation. Jesus gets at that idea when he says that the sun rises on both the evil and the good, that it rains on both the just and the unjust. Now, he's not talking about people in a generation, but he's saying the way that God deals with people is that often everybody in a community especially gets dealt with the same way, whether they're evil or good, whether they're just and unjust. And the reality is that even in these wicked generations, the faithful were swept away with the wicked. That even if there were faithful people in there, they were swept away and given the same punishments as the wicked within that generation. They faced punishment in the wilderness. They were taken by the swords. They suffered the loss of their priests and their sons and their daughters. And the reason it matters is because even though the generation was wicked, even though there were elements and aspects of the generation that made, by whatever metric God uses, that made him say this was a rebellious and stubborn generation, there was nevertheless a remnant. There was a group of people who were still faithful and still passing on the values of the community. That there were people that were passing on the word of God and what God had done, even in the midst of a wicked generation. The only reason that the psalmist has the ability to write this song for the congregation is because somebody in that wicked generation passed it on. And this is the way that values are passed on. The means through which generations are shaped, and in particular, the passing along of the values of God, is when generations pass it on to generations. That is the way generations are shaped. I find this is something we see all around us. One of the key elements that shapes generations is whatever social values are passed on to the children from the generation ahead of them. It might be social and moral values, or it might be whatever parenting style is in vogue at the time. You know, I find it ironic that when we criticize a generation, particularly the one that's coming right behind us, or maybe two behind us, when we criticize them, most of the time we're really just criticizing the generation that raised them. You know, like everyone loves to laugh or complain about the millennials. Somebody parented the millennials. They did not come up with participation trophies. That was somebody else. So you can say that there are things you don't like for, some of the way that the millennials view the world, and you can make comments about it, but that's not their fault. Somebody else raised them and passed on values and shaped them. Every generation takes both implicit and explicit direction from the generations ahead of them. Some stuff is taught, other stuff is caught. But either way, the good news is that with each generation, there's an opportunity to reset the legacy that we're leaving behind. There's an opportunity to reset the things that we're passing on. What do we want the future generation to know about what God has done? And the question is, will we pass on the values of God? We are the beneficiaries of the promises of God that were passed down to us from previous generations. We are the beneficiaries. We are the ones who have received it. And the failure to recognize that what we have is something we've received will lead to the inability to pass it on to the next generation. Both of these things, the inability to see that we've received something, that we're beneficiaries, and the lack of desire to pass it forward, stem from the same position, a position of pride. Both are manifestations of saying, what I have is something that I, and I alone, have earned. I've seen a lot of churches where the only people in leadership are in their 60s and 70s. A lot of churches. And it's not surprising that in most cases there aren't many young people at those churches. I've seen other churches where the people that are in charge are in their 50s and 60s. Now those churches look good. They look good on the outside because those churches typically have a lot of money. Because if you're in your 50s and 60s, you probably feel like you've got everything going for you. You probably still feel healthy. You're at your prime earning years. You're smart. You know how to lead organizations. You have experience. So those churches look good on the outside because the people in leadership are in their prime. But the danger in almost all of those churches, regardless of how big they are right now, the danger is that the money and the success are just masking the reality that there aren't many young people committed to their church. See, the church looks good, everything looks fine because the finances are still strong, but there's a generational gap forming. It's just not visible yet. They'll see it eventually. And if you're in one of those churches and you have the eyes to see it, and I've talked to pastors of churches like that, and they would say to me, no one else in our church realizes this is happening because the church looks good on the outside. But there's a generational gap forming. And if we don't correct it now, it's going to destroy the church in the long run. Because they haven't passed it on to those who are coming before them or coming after them. Many fewer churches look like our church, where most of the people that are leading ministries and are in charge are in their 30s and 40s. And we receive input from generations ahead of us. But for the most part, most leadership is in their 30s and 40s. Now, the only reason I bring that up is this. Because in another 10 years, God willing, we'll be celebrating our 20th anniversary. And in another 10 years, those leaders today that are in their 30s and 40s are going to be in their 40s and 50s. And we will be faced with a question. Will we pass on the leadership to the next generation? Or will we hold on to it because we earned it, we did it, we've been here, they don't know, they don't want it? Or will we be willing, those of us who are in leadership now, including myself, it's not that all of a sudden you become unuseful. Like you hit 50 and you're like, boot, well, I'm irrelevant. But it's that you have to make a conscious effort to raise up younger leadership with all the risks that takes because you have to pass it on to the next generation. And if you fail to do it, we will look good from the outside 10 years from now, but there will be a generational gap forming because we were unwilling to actually pass on to the next generation what God has done. And why wouldn't we do that? In 10 to 15 years, those people being raised up into leadership will be our kids. I mean, I know it doesn't seem that far off, and for some of you it's a little bit longer, but like for some of us it's a decade, and our kids will be coming back from college, and they'll be hopefully wanting to get re-involved in the church, but in leadership positions. And it seems like an obvious thing to do, but by all appearances, it usually doesn't happen. Most churches don't do that. And I think the reason that most churches don't do that, and the risk to us, and the reason we won't want to do it, is because when it comes to that time, to give leadership to the next generation is to be willing to live with the question, what if they destroy what we built? Did we build it? I didn't realize that the church was ours to keep. Transitioning leadership within the same church, by the way, is a lot less risky than trying to plant a church with 20 and 30-year-olds. But it feels more risky. It feels risky, because the problem is when we do that, it means that we have to maybe lay our preferences aside. It means that we need to let those youngsters do whatever they're going to do. And it might mean that they do things differently than us, or they might want to do things differently or take different chances or different risks. But see, the church isn't ours to keep. The church is God's. We're just stewards. And raising up and building up young leaders to come into leadership is part of what it means to tell the story of previous generations to those who will come behind us, knowing that if the church is going to succeed, it's going to require generations to pass it on to generations. And if we want to remember that 10 years from now, we have to remember the main thing about this passage. And the main thing is this: we remember that God is always faithful. God is always faithful. That's the people's failure is not the main point of Psalm 78. The main point of Psalm 78 is God's faithfulness. We live in a society that's so quick to point out people's failures and our own successes that I'm not even sure we're equipped to look at something like this and realize that the main point is God's faithfulness. I laughed this week because, again, every generation hands down some mixture of things that are positive and things that are negative. I don't know how the percentage shakes out, but I was listening to Golick and Wingo like I do every day when I drive the kids to school. And if you're not familiar with the show on ESPN, it's hosted by Mike Golick Sr. and Trey Wingo. And in the last year, 2 years or whatever, they're joined by Mike Golick's son, Mike Golick Jr., who's much younger. And so Mike Golick Jr. got off on this whole okay boomer thing against his father and was making fun of the boomers and how they've ruined everything. And Trey Wingo stops him and says, "Do you not realize that you are sitting on a television set with your name on it? Literally, your name. Golick and Wingo, did you build the show? Did you do it? Did you bring it here?" And I laughed at the irony of the fact that he's sitting here in this joking about the millennials versus boomers, but see, it actually raises this really profound point. If every generation passes along both good and bad, how do we account for that? How are we able to live and understand and accept this reality that generations pass on both good and bad at the same time? The only answer is that we remember that it's God who is faithful. It wasn't ever about the people. It was always about the God who was faithful to the people. And as we recount the history of what God has done, and we recount the history of the people who came before us, that's the lesson. That even though there are areas where we screwed up, even though there are areas where previous generations screw up, God is still faithful. And look at your own life. Isn't it true that, like we talked about last week, there are areas of your life where you go, I shouldn't have received that blessing because I knew I was sinning at the time. I knew I was stuck in some habit. And other times where you're like, I'm doing great, and you feel like nothing's coming. And you go, what's the point of my history and what I've done? Isn't it God's faithfulness to you? It's not your faithfulness to God. When your heart failed, God's heart was still steady. Consider verse 38 to 39, and I think that this is intended to be the bridge of the song, the bridge that everything has developed into through this psalm, and he arrives at this conclusion in verse 38 to 39. Yet God, being compassionate, atoned for their iniquity and did not destroy them. He restrained his anger often and did not stir up all his wrath. He remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes and comes not again. I think that the reason that we are so prone to look down on the generation before us and to look down on the generations that are coming after us is because we don't want to admit that we ourselves are just a wind that passes and never comes again. We don't want to admit the temporary nature of our own lives. We want to hold on to it, believing that, no, we are the generation that's going to make a difference. We are the most important generation. We are the ones who surely have something else to add. And yet what we discover about God's faithfulness is that God is faithful precisely because he knows exactly who you are. He knows exactly what you're made of. You're dust. He looks at you when you fail and when you succeed, and he's like, if I'm not faithful to them, they can't handle this. They're going to be here 1 second, and then they're gone. Another way of saying it is that the reason we don't give more grace to others is that we don't actually think we need all that much grace ourselves. See, you're not going to give grace to others until you recognize that you need it yourself. But the story of the church, the story that we tell, is not of our own ability or skill or the things that we have done that were particularly profound. The story we tell is of God's faithfulness. And that is an even more distinct presence in our church than it was even in the congregations that would have been singing this psalm in the nation of Israel. And that is for this reason. Because we remember that it's God who saves. See, when the people of Israel are reading the concluding verses of this chapter, they heard that the conclusion was about David, and as far as they knew, it was. The conclusion of the psalm is that despite the ways that they had strayed from God, and because of God's faithfulness, God would continue to protect his people, and that was evidenced in the arrival of King David. But it is always God who saves. Understand that this passage, the conclusion of this passage, is ultimately pointing forward to Jesus himself. Verse 65, listen to this description. Then the Lord awoke as from sleep, like a strong man shouting because of wine. And he put his adversaries to rout. He put them to everlasting shame. This imagery, I want you to think about this for a second. When the congregation is singing this psalm, they're singing about God's faithfulness to them. They're thinking of the rise of King David. David was known as a warrior who came in and, as the Lord's anointed, cleared out God's enemies, cleared the kingdom of false gods, and became sort of the prototype of the king that God was looking for. And when David comes along, their thought is, it was like God awoke from sleep. It was like he arose from sleep because there is a sense in which he had been silent. But this is the imagery. He was like a strong man shouting because of wine. Now, is that positive imagery? Have you ever seen a strong man shouting because of wine? Have you ever been inclined to compare that man to God himself? You see a drunk man shouting, do you ever go, this reminds me of God? But this is the imagery David uses. A strong man shouting because of wine is a frightening thing. You think to yourself, this guy, he's strong, and now he's a little unhinged. But that's the metaphor that the psalmist uses. And we might think that we might want to soften it and make it more spiritual. That's not the way the psalmists talk. They don't over-spiritualize. They don't soften. They give you imagery for a reason. And I think the psalmist means exactly that when God moved and brought King David up and King David started cleaning house, there were people who thought, oh my goodness, God has come unhinged. But in like a good way. Like this God has awoken and he is reckless in his abandon for his people. He's like a strong man shouting. But like I said, it's about Jesus. And so fast forward to Jesus, and God has been silent with his people, and then God shows up as a baby in the flesh. And if you knew that he was God, and you hadn't had the years of theological training that you have coming to church, and you didn't try to soften everything to make it spiritual and easy to embrace, you would say that if the God of the universe showed up in the flesh of a child, that God must have come unhinged, like a strong person who's had too much wine. That's what you would think. You think that's insane. Why would the God of the universe subject himself to becoming a human child with all that becoming a human child entailed? He rejected the tent of Joseph. He did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loves. He built his sanctuary like the high heavens, like the earth which he has founded forever. He chose David, his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the nursing ewes, he brought him to shepherd Jacob his people, Israel his inheritance. With upright heart, he shepherded them and guided them with his skillful hand. Jesus is the descendant of King David. Jesus is the one who comes for those God has given him. Jesus builds his sanctuary like the high heavens. The temple of God is no longer built by human hands. It is the church. Jesus himself is the one who builds the new Mount Zion, the city of God, the church of God, wherein he dwells. These are the things that we remember when we recount the story of God, but it requires this. It is one thing to remember It is another thing to believe. You can remember the works of God. You can recount the works of God. The question is, do you believe that God will continue to be faithful in the future? See, the reason that we don't pass the message to our children is not because oftentimes somebody hasn't tried to give it to us. The reason we don't pass it on is because we haven't actually believed the message that we've been given. It's one thing to remember, it's another thing to embrace. There's a form that's often used when the church takes communion. And the pastor will get up before distributing the elements, and he will hold up the bread or the wine, and he will say, "Take, eat, remember, and believe." When we take Holy Communion together, when we take the Lord's Supper, we take the bread, we take the juice, we eat it or we drink it. It reminds us of all that Christ has done, but there's one more step. Do you believe? If our hope for the future of this church and the future of our children is that they'll follow God, it's going to require that we believe. Not that we show up on Sundays out of obligation, not that we serve because we have to, not that we go to church events begrudgingly because, well, this is what we've always done, but because our children see in us that we actually believe the story that we're telling. Do you believe the works of God? Do you believe that God will be faithful? This is the message of the gospel. Let's pray.